Welcome to week 2 of the course. The focus of our discussion this week will be on economic development and growth in emerging markets. Before we delve into a more academic discussion of the topic, let me set the stage with a few telling pictures. I think it would be fair to assume that very few people in this class, if any, would feel a burning desire to move to the location depicted in this photograph. There does not seem to be any economic activity worth noting. The environment is very desolate, and what's more, it looks like you're stranded in a veritable no man's land in the middle of a desert. By the same token, though, I think it would be equally fair to assume that most people would have little reservation about moving to the location in this picture. It certainly looks much more urbanized, implicitly suggesting significant economic activity, a much larger population, and an overall more comfortable environment to live in. What's more, you notice that I circled one of the buildings in this picture. And if you go back and compare this picture to the earlier one I showed, you will see why. Yes, it is indeed the same building. So this picture is indicative of significant and tangible socioeconomic growth and development over time. Now you may ask yourself what this place is. And if you want to take a guess, pause the video for a few seconds and write down where you think this is. If you have done so, the location in this picture is, yes, you guessed it correctly, Dubai, one of the 7 emirates in the United Arab Emirates straddling the Persian Gulf. Now, let us take a brief detour to China and look at Shanghai in the 1980s. In the forefront of this picture, you can see the old colonial part of Shanghai, commonly referred to as the Bund or Waitan in Chinese. The much lesser developed land area in the background is the so-called Pudong area. In the 1980s, this area of Shanghai was very thinly settled. Close to 4 decades later, this is what Shanghai looks like today. On the right-hand side of this picture, you can still see the Bund, which you saw in the foreground on the previous picture. The Pudong area, meanwhile, is truly unrecognizable, with some buildings sporting a decidedly futuristic style. Notably, the Pearl Tower, which you can see in the middle of the Pudong area as shown in this picture. On this week's Canvas page, I will also embed a brief personal video I shot from the rooftop of the Hyatt on the Bund Hotel to give you a more concrete feel for the scale and vibrancy of economic activity in contemporary Shanghai. And while we could easily come up with similar examples of economic development over time in most emerging markets, I hope that these 2 examples serve as a compelling stepping stone into a broader and more rigorous, academically focused overview of economic growth and development trends and dynamics in emerging markets. An obvious and logical point of departure for any discussion of economic growth and development seems to be gross domestic product or GDP measurement. After all, time series data of GDP will provide us with a general sense of the scale and speed of economic growth in a country. However, it is equally important to acknowledge the somewhat significant shortcomings of an exclusive reliance on GDP data. Indeed, over the last couple of years, much has been written about how GDP might not be the very best and most accurate measure of a country's level of economic growth and development. In 2016, for example, The Economist magazine noted that, quote, gross domestic product is increasingly a poor measure of prosperity. It is not even a reliable gauge of production, end quote. In October 2020, meanwhile, the magazine followed up its initial comment on the reliability of GDP data by saying that, quote, GDP is a crude proxy for a country's economic health at the best of times, the sterling efforts of government data gatherers notwithstanding." End quote. These comments beget the seemingly obvious question as to what it is about GDP that makes it less than an ideal measure, even though it is a measure that is widely used. I am highlighting this here because there are more things to consider when we look at economic development, because one economic data point, or even a set of data points, that is GDP over time, still does not paint the full picture of a country's growth trajectory and level of economic development. If you are at all intrigued by this debate, which we cannot go into great detail in this course, I would refer you to a book called The Little Big Number. The arguments that the author puts forward in this book are quite compelling indeed. In fact, he advances 4 major propositions as to why GDP is not necessarily the very best and most accurate measure of economic growth and development. First, he argues that GDP blindly counts output without taking into account or making any distinction between what is good versus bad output. So by simply looking at GDP data, we are running the risk of completely disregarding the moral and social dimensions of economic output that is captured by the data. Second, by counting only goods and services that can be described in a particular monetary value, GDP data essentially diminishes the value of all things that are essentially free, but nonetheless also contribute immensely to our overall happiness. The author articulates this viewpoint in a uniquely illustrative way in the book. Imagine, he says, a person who gets up in the morning, pours him or herself a cup of coffee, and maybe gets breakfast served by his or her spouse, and so on. While these are all things that make you inherently happy, they do not add anything to GDP. Conversely, what would add to GDP is if the person does not brew coffee at home, but instead takes a trip to Starbucks and spends money on coffee. Moreover, the person would also spend money on gas to drive to Starbucks in the first place, etc. These factors, meanwhile, all add up and contribute to GDP, whereas the free things that make us happy are not captured by GDP. Simply put then, GDP is not the end-all, be-all economic data. The third criticism of GDP, meanwhile, relates to an accounting perspective, because while GDP counts the value of all outputs, the social and environmental costs incurred to produce that output are not captured. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, wait a minute. Pollution is undoubtedly an environmental and economic cost. But pollution cleanup leads to jobs, which in turn generate economic activity. From a short-term perspective, that would certainly be an accurate argument. However, if the level of environmental degradation becomes irreversible, the long-term effect on GDP growth will be substantial and potentially will lock you into a certain level of economic development that you cannot escape from. Additionally, you may want to, or better yet, definitely should, look at the health effects of industrialization and development. And again, while that contributes to increased demand in the healthcare sector in the short to medium term, the effect of environmental pollution on people's health is equally significant, as it temporarily, or in extreme cases, permanently reduces the workforce and by extension, their meaningful contribution to the economy, which once again is a cost that is not captured by GDP. The final flaw of GDP data is the priority focus on growth, and seemingly growth at all costs. In other words, GDP does not prioritize redistributive or inclusive growth. I draw attention to these arguments because we want to think about these aspects when we look at emerging markets. Yes, we would like to see economic growth and development, which over time hopefully would raise all boats, even if it does not do so in the short run. As China's Deng Xiaoping famously said, it is okay for some people to get rich first. Now, the underlying assumption here is that over time, the benefits of economic growth and development will trickle down to all layers of society, leading in turn to a gradual reduction of gaps in socioeconomic development and prosperity. And yet, as I am sure all of you are aware, the coexistence of pockets of extreme wealth and extreme poverty is very much a reality in many developing economies today. So in the next couple of slides, I want to give you a sense of the GDP per capita picture around the world. I'm using 2018 data because that was the only data set that allowed me to provide a more detailed regional focus of GDP per capita for all parts of the world. Unsurprisingly, what you see on this global map is that the most developed parts of the world are in the northern hemisphere. North America, Europe, particularly Northern Europe, including notably Norway. But then we also have Australasia, notably Australia and New Zealand, Japan and South Korea in Northeast Asia, Hong Kong and Singapore, both of which are very difficult to discern on this map. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar are prominent outliers owing to natural resource wealth. But let us now take a more focused look at the various world regions. And I should mention here that you might want to rely on the data provided in the following maps to maybe choose a particular country to study for your paper. That is, if you want to focus on a country rather than a particular industry or even a specific company in an emerging or frontier market. Looking at North and Central America and the Caribbean, you will immediately notice that the lesser developed economies are concentrated in Central America and the Caribbean, which is not altogether unexpected. Moving on to South America, you notice that the economies of the so-called Southern Cone of South America, which is comprised of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Paraguay, are, with the exception of Paraguay, more developed than Brazil, which may seem surprising considering that Brazil had since the early 2000s been touted as one of the top emerging markets. After all, it was included in the famous BRICS listing of emerging markets: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The other reason I'm saying that this trend is surprising is because while Argentina was the richest country in South America in the early 20th century, its fortunes have decidedly deteriorated over time. Indeed, the authors of a 2018 publication in the Latin American Economic Review titled Introduction to Argentine Exceptionalism noted that, quote, Argentina began the 20th century as one of the wealthiest places on the planet. In 1913, it was richer than France or Germany, almost twice as prosperous as Spain, and its per capita GDP was almost as high as that of Canada. Until the 1930s, the French used the phrase riche comme un Argentin, rich like an Argentinian, to describe the foolishly rich, end quote. During the second half of the 20th century, however, Argentina seems to have stumbled from one economic and financial crisis to another, a trend that has persisted well into the 21st century. Now, Brazil, being, as I mentioned, a constituent member of the BRICS Club, has certainly been the subject of much hype as well, but it has generally failed to live up to its latent potential. In fact, in his 2001 book, Brazil's Second Chance, En Route Towards the First World, the author, Lincoln Gordon, has certainly tried to argue for Brazil's potential, despite the fact that, as the old saying goes, quote, Brazil is the land of the future and will always be so. In other words, The future is there, but Brazil will never actually get to grasp and hold on to that future potential. So suffice it to say that the second chance that the author has talked about has not yet crystallized into something concrete. And this despite some rather noteworthy socioeconomic achievements over time, including, most notably, the 2003 introduction of what was known as the Bolsa Familia plan, a plan that, according to a 2013 World Bank study, quote, has been key to help Brazil more than halve its extreme poverty, from 9.7 to 4.3% of the population. Most impressively, and in contrast to other countries, income inequality also fell markedly to a Gini coefficient of 0.527, an impressive 15% decrease. Bolsa Familia now reaches nearly 14 million households, 50 million people, or around a quarter of the population, and is widely seen as a global success story, a reference point for social policy around the world, end quote. Meanwhile, the December 2021 election of Gabriel Boric to become the youngest president in Chile is apparently going to push a progressive agenda that aims to tackle the glaring socioeconomic gulf that had promoted a violent uprising in 2019 is also noteworthy. To give you a sense of the extent of the rich and poor gap, consider that according to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the incomes of the richest are 25 times those of the poorest, making Chile the second most unequal OECD country in terms of household disposable income. And by the way, I offer some of these details here because, unfortunately, given our short 6-week class schedule, we will not have time to focus on South America in our subsequent regional deliberations. This should not, however, prevent any of you from focusing on this region in your paper. In fact, I hope some of you will bring a South America perspective to the class. Europe, on the other hand, at first glance seems like a distinctive outlier in any discussion of emerging markets. But I include it here because some economies in Central and Southeastern Europe are decidedly still in the emerging markets or even frontier market category. This grouping includes most notably economies that used to be part of the former communist bloc during the Cold War, which, depending on your perspective, ended with either the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 or the dissolution of the former Soviet Union on Christmas Day 1991. Now, this map also serves as a reminder, yet again, of the importance of looking at GDP data, or in this case, GDP per capita data, in its proper context. I mention this because, as you can clearly see, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, which incidentally is my former home country, and I say former because, for one, I have not lived there since 1994, and I presently am a dual citizen of both Luxembourg and the United States. But Luxembourg clearly stands out from the rest of the regional economies in Europe on a GDP per capita basis. The CIA World Factbook currently lists an estimated 2020 GDP per capita of $110,300, making Luxembourg the third richest country on a per capita basis in the world, after Liechtenstein and Monaco. This high GDP per capita, however, is partly attributed to the small population of approximately 640,000 and the fact that the country is a financial powerhouse, with the financial sector accounting for over 35% of GDP. According to the CIA World Factbook, quote, Luxembourg is the world's second largest investment fund asset domicile after the US, with $4 trillion of assets in custody in financial institutions, end quote. In other words, there are important considerations to take into account when looking at the country's GDP per capita data. Absent proper contextualization, that data would be rather meaningless. Now, that being said, it might be more useful at times to consider per capita GDP as calculated on a purchasing power parity or PPP basis, because as Investopedia puts it, that metric, quote, allows for economists to compare economic productivity and standards of living between countries, end quote. I will include regional maps with PPP data in the PowerPoint version of this lecture video in case you are interested in comparing and contrasting GDP per capita and PPP GDP per capita for various countries and/or world regions. Shifting now to Australia and Oceania, the regional GDP per capita distribution captured in this map is hardly surprising, with the developed economies of Australia and New Zealand topping the list. Small South Pacific island nation states, meanwhile, are relatively underdeveloped due to a pervasive lack of broad-based and vibrant economic sectors. In our subsequent discussion of natural resource abundance, I will highlight the South Pacific island nation of Nauru to illustrate the concept of resource curse, which resulted in a dramatic reversal of socioeconomic fortunes for this small island nation. Let's move on to Asia. As you can see, this map combines Northeast, Southeast, Central, South, and Southwest Asia. The latter is also referred to, by the way, as the Middle East, to provide a rather diverse picture of economic development. Here, Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, and Qatar are again obvious outperformers. According to one economic wealth report, Singapore is slated to become the richest country in the world on a GDP per capita basis by the year 2050. Fueling Qatar's high GDP per capita, meanwhile, is its natural resource wealth, particularly oil and natural gas. Macau surpassing Hong Kong is largely due to the fact that this former Portuguese colony enjoys the status of the world's gaming capital, far exceeding Las Vegas. That being said, Macau's fortunes have also declined somewhat over the years as the Chinese government started embarking on a very aggressive anti-corruption campaign. As a result, the casinos in Macau, which had proved highly conducive to money laundering among other things, began to see a gradual slowdown. Most of the economies in Asia do tend to fall into the emerging market or even frontier market category. For example, China may presently be the second largest economy in the world. In fact, in PPP terms, it already overtook the United States to become the largest economy in December of 2014. But by the same token, China's equally large population size ensures a rather small GDP per capita on a comparative basis. So, what are some of the specific variables and indicators of economic development that we should take into account above and beyond simple GDP and GDP per capita data points? The indicators listed on this page are by no means an exhaustive list. However, they each provide valuable information that can help to fine-tune your analysis of emerging and/or frontier market potential. For example, you want to take into account education levels in the country. How many years of education do people have before joining the workforce? What is the quality of education? Is there equal access to education? As you may be aware of, in some emerging and frontier markets, there has been a distinctive gender bias when it comes to access to education. Consider, for example, Afghanistan, which under the Taliban rule between 1994 and 2001 effectively prevented young girls beyond a certain age from gaining access to additional education. And what is the situation now as the Taliban effectively returned to power in August of 2021? The broader point here is that any emerging or frontier market that effectively disenfranchises a portion of the population from access to education based on gender is effectively self-limiting the country's full economic potential. After all, women, as the saying goes, hold up half, if not more than half of the sky. Disenfranchising the female population from access to education thus effectively prevents them from making tangible contributions to economic growth and output. Additionally, you may want to look at infrastructure investments in the country. Underdeveloped or crumbling infrastructure, the latter is certainly the case in the United States these days, unnecessarily curtails the economic prospects of a country and limits the inflow of much-needed investments. I mean, ask yourself, as a business leader, what compelling value proposition can you possibly find in a country with a dilapidated and underdeveloped infrastructure? If you are in the manufacturing industry, you would need and expect a certain level of basic infrastructure to ensure that you can easily deliver needed raw materials and components to your factory, as well as move manufactured goods from the factory to market. Looking at the urban-rural divide, meanwhile, gives you a sense of the prevailing social and economic fault lines in a country. What about technology investments? Such investments are oftentimes seen as a silver bullet to facilitate leapfrogging, thus helping to reduce, if not close, the gap with the developed economies. Indeed, technological leapfrogging is a reality in many emerging markets, as we will see in the weeks ahead during some of our regional discussions. Do countries have access to the necessary natural or capital resources that are needed to fuel and sustain economic growth and development? In this context, please note that if you're resource poor, you are not necessarily condemned to economic underdevelopment. Neither, however, is the fact that if you're resource rich, invariably spelling great economic fortune. Access to capital resources, on the other hand, might refer to your ability to raise the necessary financial resources on global capital markets and/or the ability to attract inward foreign direct investments. And finally, with regard to the labor level, are the predominant economic activities centered around subsistence farming, basic, low-end, labor-intensive manufacturing, or advanced or high-tech manufacturing, or even service industries? In short, this is but a sample list of indicators that you can use in combination with basic GDP and GDP per capita data to get a more concrete sense of a country's economic health and overall growth potential. As I wrap up this initial portion of this week's discussion, I want to draw your attention to the late Hans Rosling, a Swedish physician, academic, and public speaker. He is especially well known for his unique ability to translate statistics about global poverty and development trends into visually appealing and intellectually insightful messages. Put simply, he made statistics fun and engaging. I will embed some of his videos related to the broad themes of this week's discussion onto our Canvas page in case you'd like to check out any one or all of those videos. Next, I want to briefly review a handful of the more prominent theoretical arguments pertaining to economic growth and development. Let me say at the outset, though, that I will not do justice to this graphical depiction, which is a visually simplified attempt to capture the complexities of the broader theoretical frameworks. That said, I thought it would be helpful nonetheless to outline the key arguments and approaches for your benefit, as it might just trigger a peculiar line of analytical and explanatory angles that you could apply to your paper topic. The outer circle in this regard is likely the more obviously compelling, as it features tangible issues and themes whose analytical value, even on the surface, is easily recognizable. I will zoom in a bit on some of the broader theories depicted in the inner circle, specifically mercantilism, stages of growth, structural change, and international dependency. I shall return to institutional economics in week 3, when we will shed a bit of light on the institutional contexts in emerging and frontier markets. Finally, I don't think we will need to dwell much on neoclassical economics, as I'm sure you have at least a general understanding of this perspective already. And in case you want a quick refresher, neoclassical economics as a discipline is primarily focused on the efficient allocation of scarce or limited productive resources and rests on 3 fundamental assumptions. As summarized by the Corporate Finance Institute, these assumptions are: 1, that people are rational in making choices between identifiable and value-associated outcomes. 2, an individual's purpose is to maximize utility, as a company's purpose is to maximize profits. And 3, people act independently on perfect, that is full and relevant, information. So without further ado, let's get started. Mercantilism has been widely adopted throughout history by a number of countries. From a mercantilist point of view, international trade is essentially a zero-sum game, meaning that in order for me to win, you have to lose, or vice versa. Consequently, mercantilists tend to maximize exports while minimizing imports. And it is easy to see why that would be the case. By focusing on export maximization, you accumulate wealth, which in turn translates into power. And power then guarantees you a dominant position in the broader international system. A critical element for success in this context is to ensure self-sufficiency, i.e., not having to rely too much on other countries for natural resource requirements, as well as the goods and services that you might need for your economy. Of course, in today's increasingly interdependent and interconnected world, it has become exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to act in a purely mercantilist fashion. That said, modern-day mercantilism, or neo-mercantilism, has at times made and will likely to continue to make appearances under certain macro-level conditions. For example, post-World War II Japan exhibited such tendencies, which were generally described as a necessary form of infant industry protection, i.e., shielding domestic Japanese industries from aggressive foreign competition. It is worth noting that the United States during that time generally acquiesced to this reality and did not respond forcefully to Japan's mercantilist and protectionist tendencies, as it has, for example, done towards China during the Trump administration. The reason is the primary consideration at that time was to support Japan's economic reemergence from the ashes of World War II to ensure that the country, which came to be seen as an unsinkable aircraft carrier from a geostrategic perspective, would squarely be anchored in the Western camp during the unfolding geostrategic Cold War competition between democracy and communism and capitalism versus central planning. In the 1950s, Walt Whitman Rostow, an American economist, professor, and political theorist, who subsequently went on to serve as National Security Advisor to President Lyndon Johnson from 1966 to 69, proposed a model positing that the economies of all countries correspond to one of 5 different stages of economic growth. At the bottom of the economic ladder would be a traditional society, anchored largely in subsistence agriculture and lacking any meaningful political and economic structure. The next level in this growth model is labeled preconditions to takeoff, which is essentially an intermediary stage between a traditional society and the beginning of tangible industrial development and growth. External investment and increasing exploitation of natural resources are the broad hallmarks of the preconditions to takeoff stage. In this stage, agriculture develops from its earlier subsistence level to a more productive and commercial stage. Having thus paved the way, a country can move into the takeoff stage, which reflects a truly consequential shift in a country's economic development trajectory. At this stage, urbanization registers a definite growth trend, industrialization proceeds apace, and employment is transitioning away from primary economic activities to secondary economic activities. Focused deployment of technology and gradual yet irreversible waves of technological upgrading and breakthroughs fuel increased levels of productivity. This progression along the productivity frontier in turn sustains the drive to maturity, which is the fourth stage in Rostow's model. A large commercial economy begins to develop alongside an expanding integration into the global economy and diversification of the industrial base. And finally, the age of mass consumption marks the end stage of a country's growth trajectory. Now, while the model may look rather logical, I should also point out that it drew significant criticism. Indeed, with its development following on the heels of the 1948 enactment of the European Recovery Program, more commonly known as the Marshall Plan, it appeared to presume that the development path of Western economies would be a one-size-fits-all formula that would have universal applicability. In other words, it was criticized for what was perceived as a rather ethnocentric development model that would leave little room for alternative paths or situational peculiarities of countries that might not align with the broad conditions and realities of Western countries. With this in mind, the fundamental learning point, once again, is that taking into account the unique situational realities of any emerging or frontier market is absolutely crucial to developing a clear-eyed, objective, and value-free analysis of underlying development challenges and opportunities. What are the unique historical experiences of the country that you want to study? What are the current social, economic, ethnic, political, racial, religious, and even environmental realities of the country? A simple formulaic approach, while elegant and easily deployed, on the other hand, will ultimately yield only minimally relevant insights at best, or prove to be an entirely self-defeating analytical exercise at worst. Meanwhile, in the field of structural change theory, some of the dominant scholars included Alfred Lewis and Hollis Chenery. Lewis proposed the so-called dual sector model, also known as the Lewis model. At the heart of this model lies the argument that the growth in developing economies is reflected in the transition or the move of labor from rural to urban areas, a trend which he describes as a transition between the subsistence and the capitalist sectors. And indeed, such a dynamic tends to unfold in most, if not all, developing economies over time. Against the backdrop of economic reform, restructuring, and liberalization, this move is also usually unidirectional. That is, from the rural to the urban areas, but not vice versa. And it generally tends to be irreversible. Hollis Chenery, meanwhile, focused on patterns of industrial growth. And according to his theory, the prevailing patterns of national development tend to correlate with a country's size and availability of resources. In his article titled Pattern of Industrial Growth, which was published in 1960 in the American Economic Review, Chenery notes, among others, quote, "Because of the diversity of natural resources, we should not expect to find uniform patterns of growth in all countries," end quote. And by now, such an argument should be familiar to you because I mentioned on a number of occasions that we need to pay attention to the peculiar conditions and realities on the ground in the country under study in order to develop a coherent analysis and understanding of the dynamics of economic growth and development. Chenery goes on to acknowledge that, quote, "Growth is likely to be accelerated by anticipating desirable changes in the resource use and retarded by institutional arrangements or government policies that inhibit such changes," end quote. I'm highlighting this latter point because we will elaborate on the importance of institutional factors in week 3. The international dependency theory, meanwhile, rose to prominence in the 1970s and was to a large extent driven by the failure of earlier models of development in explaining the dynamics in developing economies. Specifically, the theory defines the obstacles to development in developing and underdeveloped countries as primarily external in nature, rather than country-specific. Put differently, underdeveloped and developing countries, which constitute the periphery and semi-periphery respectively, are considered to be dependent on developed or core economies. Now, seen through the lens of colonialism, the underlying dynamic is one of resource exploitation of developing and underdeveloped economies at the hands of developed economies. Under this arrangement, natural resources are being shipped to the core economies to fuel their economic engines and manufacturing activities. Excess finished goods are subsequently exported back to the periphery and semi-periphery, which only then tends to exacerbate the challenges of developing a vibrant, homegrown production base in those economies. In other words, under colonialism, developing and underdeveloped economies were drawn into the global economy through sheer exploitation. The modern-day equivalent of this dynamic centers around exploitation of cheap labor. The overarching priority of any developing economy is to reduce, if not close, the developmental gap with industrialized economies. One obvious way of achieving that goal is to ensure sustained and rapid economic growth over time. And while this is both logical and laudable, it is also worth keeping in mind that rapid economic growth can at times unleash destabilizing forces, as the economist Menker Olson argued in the pages of the Journal of Economic History in 1963. Rapid economic growth invariably leads to social dislocation. And consequently, as Olson put it, quote, "Contrary to what is usually assumed, economic growth can significantly increase the number of losers. It is not only a logical possibility, but also at times a practical probability that the number getting poorer will increase with rapid economic growth. This is because in periods of rapid economic growth, there are often several forces that work toward a concentration of most of the gains in a relatively small number of hands and to a widespread diffusion of the losses," end quote. So the simple fact that you commit to economic growth and aspire to a specific developmental goal does not necessarily lead you to achieve that goal, because the path to that goal may feature a number of roadblocks that can potentially knock you off course. Another prominent concept in development economics that invariably weighs heavy on the minds of policymakers in developing economies is the so-called middle income trap. And let me illustrate this concept with a simple graphic. The initial growth spurt that a developing economy might experience may be triggered by economic liberalization, a commitment to privatization, that is, reducing the prominence of the state in the economy, and even by tentative steps of gradual integration with the global economy. The combination of these factors puts a developing economy on a dynamic growth path that may extend some 10 to 20 years, depending on the breadth and depth of initial commitment to economic growth. And then the domestic economy is going to reach a critical juncture, beyond which the future growth path depends largely on specific policy priorities embraced by the government, institutional and regulatory efficiencies, as well as the very nature of the growth and development ecosystem that the government may or may not have nurtured in the initial 10 to 20 years of economic growth. In the best case scenario, the country can find itself well on track to achieving high income status in the future, supported in large measure by the creation of internal value through human capital upgrading. In other words, countries achieve this goal through a sustained and unrelenting embrace of Joseph Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction, Harvard Business School's Clayton Christensen's notion of disruptive innovation, continuous human skills development and upgrading, as well as technology investments, and above all, generation of domestic consumption. The latter point is especially important because, as modern history of economic development has repeatedly shown, emerging and frontier markets' initial stage of economic growth tend to be fueled by export-led industrialization. And while there is nothing inherently wrong with that, it is important to acknowledge that exclusively export-led industrialization cannot be sustained indefinitely. And what's more, an indefinite and singular commitment to export-led industrialization would dramatically increase a country's vulnerability to global economic downturns and crises. Now, on the other hand, if a country fails to prioritize investment in training, education, institutional and infrastructure development, etc., it is likely to face the very distinct possibility of not being able to grow beyond a middle-income country. Countries that find themselves in a middle-income trap tend to share a number of similarities. Notably, the initial growth of these countries tend to be fueled by natural resource abundance, increased trade opportunities as a result of expanding global economic integration, attraction of foreign direct investment or FDI, and overseas development assistance or ODA, an emphasis on big public works projects, etc. At the same time, though, many of these countries also witnessed the gradual expansion of asset bubbles that invariably, due to a lack of rigorous regulatory, accountability, and transparency processes, ended up bursting and consequently triggering widespread economic pain. The term middle income trap was initially coined in 2005 by economists Inda McGill and Homi Kharas. They defined middle-income countries in a 2007 publication as, quote, economies squeezed between the low-wage, poor country competitors that dominate in mature industries and the rich country innovators that dominate in industries undergoing rapid technological change, end quote. Put differently, from a business perspective, low-income countries may enjoy a labor cost advantage initially, but over time, the cost factors will invariably increase as a result of rising standards of living. China, for example, has experienced this gradual loss in labor cost advantage relative to other regional economies, and we shall return to that phenomenon in our Asia regional discussion in the weeks ahead. Now, the underlying reason that prompted Gill and Kharas to coin the term middle income trap in the first place was to draw attention to the fact that prior rapid economic growth does not necessarily imply sustainability of such growth in the future. And at the same time, it was also hoped that the term itself would trigger domestic level discussions regarding necessary and appropriate policy choices to ensure that the country would stay on a sustainable growth path. Some countries have indeed lived up to that expectation with the development of institutions that effectively serve as developmental pilot agencies, which is a concept that we shall revisit briefly in week 3 as well. The concept of middle income trap, meanwhile, also generated a somewhat lively debate as to whether it is a real phenomenon or primarily a myth. The simple fact is that while some countries are indeed stuck at a middle income level, there's also a sizable number of countries that have successfully avoided the middle income trap between the 1950s and the present, as shown in this table. The catch-up industrialization model, developed by Japanese economist Kenichi Ohno, depicts a dynamic path for countries to escape the middle income trap. At stage 0, developing economies acknowledge the existence of a wide gap between them and developed economies. The gradual onset of a manufacturing base, combined with initial success in attracting foreign direct investment, paves the way for countries to move away from subsistence agriculture and aid dependency. Consequently, countries are elevated to stage 1, which is characterized by simple manufacturing that benefits from foreign guidance. As countries begin to expand these manufacturing activities, they gradually also begin to register on the radar screens of more and more foreign companies that are consistently looking for new labor cost advantages and thus are likely to outsource or offshore basic manufacturing activities to such newly developing economies, resulting in an agglomeration effect, or, to borrow Francois Perou's term, a growth pole. The development of such agglomeration economies in turn leads to stage 2, at which point a country begins to witness the development and expansion of supporting industries, thus adding a further layer of activity to overall economic development. Up until this stage, however, everything by and large still tends to be dependent on foreign guidance. At this juncture, technological absorption becomes a critical factor in a country's ability to transition to stage 3, which is defined by mastery of management and technology, as well as the ability to produce high-quality goods. This transition from stage 2 to stage 3 is also where developing economies traditionally cross the threshold of a middle-income country. Some economies will find it much harder than others to effectively implement the breadth and depth of technology absorption that is necessary to escape the middle-income trap. Those economies that have successfully transitioned to stage 3 and are subsequently able to create an ecosystem that fosters creativity will ultimately be able to develop full capability in innovation and product design and become vibrant, dynamic, developed economies such as the United States and the European Union. Operating at the technology frontier, such economies are able to also nurture global leaders in a variety of industries. Complementing the catch-up industrialization dynamic is a model of industrial development that has come to be known as the so-called flying geese model. Initially conceived by Japanese economist Kaname Akamatsu in the 1930s, it grew especially popular in the 1950s and early 1960s as a result of Japan's successful post-war economic takeoff. The flying geese metaphor is based on the fact that as countries climb up the industrial development ladder, they will invariably jettison lower-level manufacturing and industrial activities, which in turn will be adopted by economies that are still lagging behind in industrial development. On the whole, the catch-up industrialization process rests on three pillars, which I call the three I's. First, there is the intra-industry aspect, which focuses on product development within a particular industry that is expanding over time. Next is the inter-industry aspect, which is when you begin to notice tangible development and diversification of a broad range of industries within a country. Additionally, you begin to see gradual upgrading of industrial activities from consumer goods to capital goods and from simple to more sophisticated manufacturing. And finally, there is the international aspect, which focuses on the subsequent relocation of entire industries from advanced to developing economies, because the latter, though still catching up, still benefit from a comparative cost competitiveness. Economies that are successful in escaping the middle income trap are invariably able to focus on an improved global value chain engagement. Now, this is certainly a mouthful, so what exactly do we mean by that? Well, let me illustrate this with an example from this table, which is drawn from a 2017 study titled "The Middle Income Trap and Upgrading Along Global Value Chains." Take a look, for example, at the row labeled "Typical Specialization," and what you will notice is that the way to effectively escape the middle income trap is for countries to relentlessly progress from simple to intermediate all the way to complex industries. In other words, a country's initial industrialization stage may be based on commodity production, then subsequently expand into advanced manufacturing, and ultimately lead to sustained investments in research and development, operating on the technological frontier and focusing on the highest value-adding activities. A second example of conceptualizing the ability to escape the middle income trap is by looking at the mode of competition. The key here is for economies to chart a course that takes them away from an initial focus on price to quality competitiveness through non-price competitiveness all the way to competitiveness driven exclusively by brand and value-added features that derive from the ability to effectively and efficiently operate on the technological frontier. Ultimately, then, the ability of a country to convincingly escape the middle income trap is tied to the improvement in the quality of industrial policy. In other words, over time, the quality rather than the quantity of foreign direct investment inflows is going to be a critically important game changer. Additionally, deliberate and credible commitment to increasing the competitiveness of private enterprises rather than focusing on large state-owned enterprises, which, by the way, more often than not are inefficient and loss-making, is equally important. Third, government priorities need to be squarely focused on sustaining the initial commitment to economic liberalization. Fourth, look for signs that suggest whole-scale governmental commitment to investing in quality infrastructure that can help attract foreign direct investment. And finally, the development of an ecosystem that prioritizes high quality and impactful education as well as skills development and stresses the ability to absorb and deploy the know-how and technology that is needed to drive industrial growth and operational efficiency is yet another non-negotiable success factor. So, to conclude part one of this week's video lecture, the formula for success appears simple enough, yet it can prove difficult to implement. At the end of the day, though, the ability to escape the middle income trap depends on the above-mentioned priorities.